I have a little bit of a sidebar regarding NAD. What NAD stands for is, unbelievably, nicotine adenine dinucleotide. You heard right, nicotine adenine dinucleotide. It's another nucleic acid, much like adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine, only NAD is not used to make DNA. Its purpose is to pick up high-energy electrons in glycolysis. That's its job. The aside, a little bit of a sidebar, is that back in the 90s, the attorney generals of most of the states in the United States sued the major tobacco companies, R.J. Reynolds, and I forget what the names of the others are, for addicting people to cigarettes and cigarette smoking and causing cancer and killing people. They won the case, which is why today you see no cigarette ads in magazines, on television, on the billboards. The Marlboro man used to be all over the place when I was a kid on billboards. He'd be riding off in the sunset on his horse on television and in magazines. Well, you don't see that anymore. What you see instead, and is being paid for by the award that was won in that case, are ads vilifying and encouraging people not to smoke. The heads of the tobacco companies had to appear and testify and defend their product in front of the congressional committee doing the investigation on behalf of this lawsuit, and they couldn't defend nicotine in any way, shape, or form. Nicotine does everything that we know it does. It was claimed it did. It kills people, causes emphysema, causes cancer, and it is addictive. Anyone who smokes knows that. The the most absurd justification or defense that I heard from one of the tobacco company heads was, and I'm not making this up, he actually said this, he said, I eat gummy bears. I love gummy bears. I can stop eating gummy bears whenever I want. I'm not addicted to them. That was his argument to suggest that you can stop, anybody who smokes can stop at any time. They're not addicted to the nicotine, or nicotine doesn't cause an addiction to cigarettes. I would argue that had they come up with the following defense, they might have won the case. Much as getting O.J. Simpson off the hook for having murdered his wife, the jury was swayed by a blood-soaked glove that had shrunk and didn't fit his hand, as against the evidence that would have convicted him, the DNA fingerprint. That this argument might have won the case in a similar fashion for the tobacco companies. Here's the argument. I haven't told you what NAD stands for, I don't think. NAD stands for nicotine adenine dinucleotide. You heard me right, nicotine. So their argument could simply have been to say, hey, nicotine's already in us. It's a naturally occurring substance in our body. How can it possibly harm you to take it in from a cigarette when it's already in you in the first place? For a lot of people in the general public, that would have been it. That would have been the clincher, I think. Think of sodium chloride. We sprinkle it on our food all the time. It's table salt. It doesn't kill us. Well, I mean, in large amounts, it would. It does cause hypertension, which, is a killer. It causes high blood pressure and strokes if you eat a lot of salty foods. But in moderation, it's not going to do us in. Well, sodium chloride is a sodium atom hooked up to a chlorine atom. Now, what if I took those apart? You can take them apart and have chlorine, which usually exists as a gas, and sodium, which exists as a solid at room temperature. If a railroad tanker car carrying chlorine gas derails and fractures, they would evacuate a 50-mile radius around that derailed car because a cloud of chlorine gas is deadly. It'll kill you if you inhale it. Think about what chlorine does in a pool just a little bit of it to get rid of the germs in a pool when people are swimming in it. It causes your eyes to water. In the same way, a chunk of sodium, a gram of sodium, would kill you if you ate it outright. Hooked up to each other, you can easily sprinkle it on your food and not worry about it. In the same way, nicotine attached to adenine dinucleotide is harmless. By itself, it'll addict you. So there's again an example of how the structure of molecules makes a big difference. But I do think that had they brought up the fact that nicotine is the naturally occurring substance in us, they might have won the case for the tobacco industry, and we'd still see the Marlboro man riding off into the sunset, smoking a cigarette. Anyway, moving on. The sixth reaction here, finally. Notice how this is the opposite of what we saw up here. ATP gave up a phosphate, went to ADP. Here, ADP gains a phosphate, goes to adenosine triphosphate. If this gave up energy, then this must require energy to put a phosphate back on ADP to make it ATP. Guess where the energy comes from? It comes from this reaction. Reaction number 6, which is sufficiently exergonic. There's enough electrons falling from high to low orbits to be able to harness that delta G, that energy, and use it to phosphorylate in ADP to ATP. You've just made some coin for yourself. Use whatever analogy you want. You've charged the battery. And the same happens over here. So you get 2 ATPs in reaction number 6. Because you have 2 exergonic reactions that produce a sufficient amount of delta G to use that energy to phosphorylate ADP to ATP. So at this point you're flush. It cost you 2 ATP up here. I'm sorry, I just raised this up again here. And you got 2 ATP back. You're even if this was a financial transaction. Reaction number 7, nothing much happens. Don't have to waste much time with reaction number 7. Reaction number 8, there is a molecule of water released as a waste product in reaction number 8. That's all we have to remember about that reaction. A molecule of water is being released in reaction number 8. We started with a molecule of glucose, and here water is released in reaction number 8. Just again, bear that in mind. And finally, reaction number 9, we have yet another exergonic reaction providing enough delta G to phosphorylate yet another 2 ADPs to ATP. So we get another 2 ATPs, another 2 coins in our pocket for having broken glucose down all the way to these 2 3-carbon halves, which are pyruvate. And some textbooks refer to as pyruvic acid. Pyruvate. That's the end product of glycolysis. So it cost us 2 ATP up front. We got 2 here and 2 more here. We now have a net gain of 2 ATPs at the end of glycolysis from having broken down 1 glucose to all the way down to pyruvate. Doesn't seem like much, does it? 2 ATP. I mean, you can go look up what the calories are, the caloric value, or the electron volts, which is another way of measuring energy, in an ATP, and see how far 2 ATP will get you. I can tell you, not very far, if you're walking to school. But remember, there are a gazillion glucose molecules in a bowl of pasta. And we're only working with 1 here. So those are the highlights of glycolysis. Let's summarize. We start with the molecule of glucose. We end with pyruvate down at the bottom here. Glucose we start with, end with pyruvate. In the process, we use 2 ATP, but we generate 4 for a net gain of a plus 2 ATP. In addition, nicotine adenine dinucleotide picks up a high energy electron riding piggyback on a hydrogen atom, which means there is lots of potential energy inside this taxicab that we can use at some point, and that some point we'll get to eventually, and takes it off here and here. And finally, the other important point is these 2 molecules of water that are being generated down here as a waste product in reaction number 8. So let's go back to the overall summary reaction of heterotrophic metabolism and see what we've covered. There it is right here. What did we cover in this reaction? We started with glucose, so that's covered. All right, so you can underline that and say, well, that's completely covered. There was no place, I'm not going to flip back to that slide, but trust me, there was no place in glycolysis where there was an arrow pointing into the pathway saying we used oxygen. At no place did we need oxygen to carry out glycolysis. So we haven't covered oxygen at all. There was no place in glycolysis where we produce carbon dioxide. So we haven't covered carbon dioxide at all. There was one place in glycolysis where we produce 2 water molecules. So you can, I'll let you know now, there will be more water produced later on. So you can put a dotted line under water for now. Not a solid line because we haven't produced all the water that we're going to produce. You can put a solid line under glucose because we've used that at the beginning. That's what we started with. And we produced a little bit of energy, those 2 ATP molecules and the potential energy of the high energy electrons in the NAD taxicab. That's energy that we produce. The ATP is directed. That can be used right away. The NAD with its high energy electron passenger, that we can't use right away. We have to process that a little bit more. But anyway, that's potential energy, and the ATP is direct energy. So we can put a dotted line under the energy here because there's more energy yet to come. So that's what we've accomplished in glycolysis. What is important about glycolysis, apart from the fact that we've produced some energy, is that it does not require oxygen. That's very important because in the primordial ocean, there was no photosynthesis. And if there's no photosynthesis, there's no oxygen being produced to waft up into the atmosphere to put the oxygen in the atmosphere that we have now. The primordial atmosphere did not have oxygen in it, therefore there was none available for a heterotrophic organism to carry out this process to completion. All a heterotroph could do at that time is basically get the piano down the first flight of stairs. Because that first flight of stairs, glycolysis, does not require oxygen. This is what's known as an anaerobic mechanism. Without oxygen, anaerobic. Aerobic is with oxygen. We do aerobic exercises to get our heart rate and our breathing rate up. That's an aerobic exercise. Anaerobic means we're not sucking oxygen. And so that's very important because heterotrophic life would have never gotten off the ground, so to speak, if it had relied on oxygen, because again, in the primordial ocean, there wasn't any oxygen available. In the primordial atmosphere, there wasn't any oxygen available. So that's one reason that glycolysis, even though it doesn't produce a lot of energy per glucose molecule, was extremely important because it allowed heterotrophic life to at least avail itself of the few organic substances that were floating around in the ocean at the time and metabolize them. It's also important very personally for us, and especially if we're athletes, glycolysis. Because here's what we're able to do owing to glycolysis. Oh, I'll try to remember to come back to this slide. Well, let me just point out quickly. This is the mitochondria, and remember the powerhouse of the cell. This is outside of the mitochondria. Glycolysis takes place outside of the mitochondria and not inside the mitochondria. This is evolutionarily important because bacteria can carry out glycolysis. They don't need a mitochondria to carry out the other two pathways. That is more evidence, of course, that bacteria were the first forms of life on Earth. If you don't need a mitochondria, in other words, if you don't have to be a eukaryotic organism, and you can carry out glycolysis, and there wasn't any oxygen in the atmosphere, and you're an anaerobic bacterium, you've got all the tools necessary to be the first form of life on Earth. Okay. But here's why glycolysis is important to you and me, and especially if you're an athlete. Here's someone just walking their dog. She's got her mouth open, so obviously she's breathing, but she's not breathing heavily. She's breathing at a rate that is equal to the rate at which the muscles are using the energy that, she consumed over breakfast or lunch. All right? So if the muscles are if their muscles are metabolizing the blood glucose at the same rate that she's taking in oxygen, it's an aerobic mechanism. To jump ahead a bit, let me see, where am I? These two pathways, the second set of stairs and the third set of stairs, they require oxygen. In order to complete this entire reaction, we're going to need oxygen by the time we get to the second stairway, by the time we get to the Krebs cycle. In order to completely metabolize glucose to carbon dioxide and water and get all the energy out of the glucose molecule that we can possibly extract from it, we have to take it all the way through the electron transport system. And in order to do that, since the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system require oxygen, we need oxygen. Glycolysis does not need oxygen. So, if we can match the rate at which our muscles are metabolizing glucose and our heart and lungs can get oxygen to the muscles, we can take that glucose and carry it all the way through glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the citric acid cycle, and completely take the glucose through the entire metabolic process. What if, however, we're running a race and we intend to win the gold medal and, break the ribbon before everybody else? And if you've ever run a marathon, you would know this, that for most of the race, you want to be very careful to balance your oxygen intake with your muscles' ability to metabolize your food, the organic material that you're metabolizing, that you have for breakfast and lunch. Toward the end of the race, now, of course, for the bulk of the race, you better keep abreast with the pack. And if you can do that, and while also not exceeding your muscles' ability to, again, work at a pace with which your heart and lungs can deliver oxygen to them, you're golden. Stay with the pack. You don't exceed your muscles' aerobic ability. Then, depending on the length of the race, the last, 7, 8, 10 miles, maybe, not that much, maybe I'm thinking kilometers, maybe the last mile, 2, 3 miles, you go into a sprint. And this is where you give it your all and get ahead of the pack and hopefully break the ribbon and win the gold medal. However, what you're doing when you go into the sprint, you're asking your muscles to work faster than your heart and lungs can deliver the oxygen. Your muscles are doing overtime. Your heart and lungs are not. Your heart and lungs, of course, are extremely powerful. Otherwise, you wouldn't be running the race in the first place. You wouldn't be Marion Jones there in the photograph running the Olympics. So obviously, you've trained your heart and your lungs to have the maximum aerobic ability that they could possibly have. But even then, that last part of the race, you're asking them basically to loan you, you're asking the muscles to loan you the energy in the absence of your ability to get oxygen to them. So the deal you're making with your muscles is this. You're asking them to carry out glycolysis. They cannot carry out the Krebs cycle and electron transport system because you're not giving them the oxygen to do that. And you're asking them to carry out anaerobic metabolism via glycolysis temporarily. And you as an athlete have to know exactly how long that you're able to carry out that temporary anaerobic activity, because if you start too soon, your muscles are not going to be able to see you through to the tape. If you start too late, other people will pull ahead of you. What you're asking your muscles to do is to bank the end product of glycolysis. What's the end product of glycolysis? Pyruvate. Now we still have to take the pyruvate through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system. It's not like you've been forgiven. You know, your loan has been forgiven. No, you're still going to have to pay back the loan, but we're going to hold it off for a while. We're going to suspend the payments. We're going to bank the pyruvate. The muscles are going to bank the pyruvate. And they store pyruvate for as long as, they can. Which, again, if you're a good athlete, won't be will be as long as it takes for you to sprint to the finish line. While they're doing that, I keep going back and forth here. Pyruvate is a toxic substance to your muscles. Too much of it is noxious to your muscles. It poisons your muscles. And so what they do when you're in an anaerobic activity is they turn pyruvate into lactic acid. I don't have a slide for that here. Lactic acid, L-A-C-T-I-C, lactic acid. You athletes know about this. Lactic acid detoxifies the pyruvate and decreases the toxicity of pyruvate, but not by 100%. Lactic acid is also somewhat poisonous, not as poisonous as pyruvate, but it also has a toxic effect. So that once you build up a threshold of lactic acid in your muscles, game over. Your muscles go into a cramp. This is why you have to judge very carefully when you go into that sprint, because if you go into the sprint too soon, your muscles will shut down on you because you built up too much lactic acid before you got to the finish line. But that's the deal you're making with your muscles. Get me to the finish line, and I'll pay you back later. What happens, hopefully you win the race, break the tape, get the gold medal, but before you get the gold medal, right after you break the tape, you basically double over and you're gasping for breath. Why? Because now the muscles who have banked this pyruvate as lactic acid, while you're being congratulated for winning the race, they're busy taking this pyruvate and sending it to the liver with the lactic acid and sending it to the liver where the lactic acid is being turned back to pyruvate. And that pyruvate is then shunted into the next metabolic pathway, the next flight of stairs called the Krebs cycle. But again, the Krebs cycle and electron transport system require oxygen. So in order for that pyruvate to go into the Krebs cycle, you've got to provide the oxygen, and that's why you're gasping. because you've got a lot of lactic acid built up that the liver now turns back into pyruvate and is giving to the Krebs cycle. In order for the Krebs cycle to churn all that pyruvate, that backlog of pyruvate, you're going to be sucking a lot of oxygen in order for that to happen. So we can thank glycolysis because we are able to sustain temporary high rates of anaerobic activity because of glycolysis. If our muscles weren't able to do that, we'd always be walking the dogs and never doing anything much more active than that. We have another reason to thank glycolysis. Those of us who like to indulge ourselves in a spirit now and again. Depending on what organism you give sugar to, different organisms will end up with a different substance at the end of glycolysis. You and I end up with pyruvate at the end of glycolysis. If you give sugar to yeast, the yeast ends up detoxifying the pyruvate not into lactic acid, but detoxifies the pyruvate by turning it into ethyl alcohol. Yeast piss. Which you and I use to make all of our spirits. So if you give grape sugar to yeast, you get wine. If you give barley and malt to yeast, you get beer. If you give, if your sugar comes from potatoes, what do you get from potatoes? Vodka? I don't know. That different kinds, depending on the source of the sugar, will determine your fermentation product. Fermentation is the process of basically giving sugar to yeast and having the yeast make ethyl alcohol for us. So those are some of the boons that we get from glycolysis. Even though, again, glycolysis doesn't really produce a lot of energy per carbohydrate. Life could not have, probably couldn't have, heterotrophic life couldn't have gotten started early on had it not been for glycolysis. Let me just think for a moment. Yes, heterotrophic life wouldn't have gotten started without glycolysis. You and I can thank glycolysis for being able to do something more active than walking the dogs, and we can be thankful. Those of us who enjoy spirits can thank glycolysis for that.